But as He guides us and leads us, do you ever find it difficult to follow? And as we consider life, how many of you enjoy waiting? And waiting. And waiting. And we as human beings, and I think even more so when we think about our Western civilization and our culture, and we want everything now. How many of you would say instant coffee tastes better than freshly brewed coffee? Maybe there's a few of you, I don't know. But why is there so much instant coffee sold? Because it's easier. We can have it now. I don't have to take the several minutes or the whatever the process is. We want things now. How many of you would say McDonald's tastes a whole lot better than a sit-down meal or at-home meal? No. Why do we go there? Well, it's quick. It's cheaper. We're drive-through service. We're on our way. But yet, so many times in life, there are periods of waiting and trials and testing. And so many times we wonder, why is all of this happening? And so many times in those circumstances or in those times of waiting, our greatest desire is for all of our circumstances around us to change. But have you ever considered that maybe during those times of waiting and testing, that God's desire is for our character within us to change? And that's what we find in the life of Moses. Really, there is 120 years of his life, and in one sense, it's broken down into 40-year segments. His first 40 years of being raised and growing up in Egypt. His second 40 years as he runs off to the wilderness of Midian. And his third 40 years is back going to Egypt and leading the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt and wandering in the wilderness for another 40 years. But each one of those times, there was a learning and a growing. We'll go ahead and read Acts chapter 7. Simon read a portion of Acts chapter 7 last week. And in one sense, if you want to do a quick summary of the Old Testament and the growing of the children of Israel, Acts chapter 7 is a sermon that Stephen had preached. And really, he just runs through a quick summary of the Old Testament, of Israel growing and God using them. But in verse 17, I believe verse 17 is, yes, verse 17 I'll begin reading. It says, "But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. At this time, Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God. And he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. But they did not understand. And the next day he appeared to 2 of them as they were fighting, and tried to reconcile them, saying, 'Men and brethren, why do you wrong one another?' But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, 'Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday?' Then at this, saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush, in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. Then the Lord said to him, Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their groaning, and have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt. This Moses, whom they rejected, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, and in the Red Sea, and in the wilderness 40 years. For this is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. As we read through that passage, and it's a quick overview of much of Moses' life, but notice how it mentioned towards the beginning, but when the time of the promise drew near. There was a time that God had promised certain things, really going back to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13 through 14. This was a promise that God had given to Israel. He said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. So this was a promise that God had given to Abraham. He said, yes, your descendants, they will go into a strange land, a land that is not theirs. They will be there for 400 years. They're going to go through trials and troubles and struggles, but I will bring them out. And when they come out, they will have great possession. And when you think about the timing of God, once again, when going back during COVID, one of the things that we did as a family is there was a Caterpillar kit that you could purchase. And they would send it to you. And you would get these tiny little caterpillars. And you'd have this little case where they would grow and you would have to feed them. And they eventually became monarch butterflies. And so we would have to put little orange slices in there and sweet things. And we would watch them grow. And then what happens to a caterpillar? They go into this cocoon. And for about 2 weeks, it looks like nothing is happening. But something is happening. And so many times in our lives, that seems to be the case. Nothing is happening. Now, if you are like me, you may, like when you hear the story of Joseph, and yes, it's wonderful that God used Joseph to save many people alive in the midst of the famine. But sometimes, I don't know, if you're like me, sometimes it's like, you know what, if God didn't send the famine in the first place, he wouldn't have needed Joseph to save the people in the midst of the famine. Have you ever thought something like that? Or am I the only person? Like, come on, God, like, why did you need Joseph? Like, if you just didn't even give the famine. But God was working a plan in the midst of it all. Because when God brought the family of Abraham, the family of Jacob, the family of Joseph, into Egypt, there was about 75 people. And in one sense, whether you wanted to use the analogy of a cocoon, or whether you wanted to use the analogy of a greenhouse, God used Egypt to protect the family of Israel to become from a small family of 75 people over the course of time to leave with over 500,000 men, plus all the women and children. They went into Egypt. Egypt became almost a greenhouse to protect them while they grew and prospered. And then God transplanted them after 400 years to go out of Egypt as a nation to enter into the promised land. So yes, it seems like, why did God allow the famine? God had a plan in every part, and it was protecting them. It would have been dangerous for them to grow from a family into a nation in the promised land. But God had a plan. Now, as things progressed in Egypt, Exodus chapter 1, and really if you wanted to read Exodus 1 through 4, covers basically the first 80 years of Moses' life. And then right on up to chapter 12, you have a lot of the plagues in Egypt. But in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 9, it says, "And he said to his people, look," this is Pharaoh speaking, "look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." Pharaoh sees this people growing up. In fact, if you were to go back, I believe it's in Genesis chapter 47, when Jacob's family came into Egypt, Joseph gave them the best of the land. They were farmers. Joseph gave them the best, most prosperous land for cattle. And so here they were in the best of the land of all of Egypt, growing and multiplying and becoming a nation. And Pharaoh's looking at this, wait a minute, we've got a problem. If somebody comes against us and wars against us, Israel may side with them and fight against us and leave our country. And what you find, what's interesting here, they were afraid of Israel fighting and fleeing. And so instead, they wanted to keep them, but control them. Think about that. It wasn't that, they wanted to keep them under their possession and yet control them and use them as slaves. And that is what they had become, is slaves in Egypt. Now, with this fear of Pharaoh, he made a command. All baby boys would be killed. When the midwives said, you know what, the baby boys, like all of the Hebrew women, when they give birth, they're much more lively than the Egyptian women, and they have their babies before we even arrive. So we can't kill them because they're already born. God bless the midwives, and you may, then Pharaoh says, all baby boys are to be cast into the Nile. And this was the time in which Moses was born. Not the best of times. And it would have been a time that every Hebrew woman, if there was a time to pray for a girl, this was a time to pray for a girl. If my child is a girl, we are at peace. But if my child is a boy, who knows what's going to happen? And as in the book of Acts, it mentioned that Moses' parents kept him for 3 months. For the first 3 months, you can keep a child pretty quiet. Sam mentioned to me that Alice has been quite quiet right now. And for the first 3 months, and in a sense, almost the first 9 months, many times, I know Noah, he was in the service until he was about 9 months old, and many parents that are here keep the child in here until 9 months, and it's fairly simple. But all of a sudden, they start becoming more vocal, they become more active, and it's hard to conceal it. And so Moses' mother takes him, puts him in a basket into the Nile River. And who finds him? Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter has compassion on Moses, takes him in. But not only does she take him in, but Miriam, Moses' sister, meets her and says, do you want me to find somebody to feed him? And so then Pharaoh's daughter pays Moses' biological mother to raise Moses for the first several years of his life. And then Pharaoh's daughter raises him. But what is interesting, remember the great fear that Pharaoh had, that Israel would rise up and flee. And yet, think about this. In the end, God caused Pharaoh to feed, clothe, lodge, educate, and train the very man who would one day deliver them out of the land. Think about that. Pharaoh's greatest fear. And yet God worked all of the circumstances that he was the one that actually funded the feeding and the clothing and the lodging and the educating and the training of the very man that would lead the people out of Israel. What we don't understand, we have to recognize God is at work behind the scenes. Now, as we fast forward, and we'll try to speed it up and pick up the pace, we come to the end of that 40 years. And in the world's eyes, Moses was a chosen leader. He had the best of educations. He had the best, he was trained to be a warrior. He was trained to be a leader. He was, ready possibly to be the next Pharaoh. We don't know. But yet, in God's eyes, he was not ready. And what we find in verse 25 of Acts chapter 7, it mentioned about the story. At the age of 40, he goes out and visits his people. Now, I am sure when Jochebed, his mother, had him and raised him for those first several years, she probably instilled in him as much about God and the promises and all of those things as she could. And it's amazing Amara, she's 2 years old, and the amount of songs and the things that she already knows and memorizes. And we don't know how long she might have had him till he was 3, maybe 4, maybe 5. We don't know exactly the age when she sent him back to Pharaoh's daughter. But I guarantee you, she instilled as much of God in him as she could. And he knew those promises. He knew he was an Israelite. One day he goes out to see the burden that his people are bearing. And he sees an Egyptian man beating an Israelite. What does he do? He looks around, nobody's looking, and he killed the Egyptian. And then buries him in the sand. Nobody will ever know. The only people that saw it were Israelites. They're going to keep their mouth shut, right? Definitely not. The second day, we don't know if it was the very next day or it was probably the second day that he went out to see the Israelites. It could have been a span of time. Probably, most likely, it was a span of time, for the rumor of Moses' killing had spread. But the next time he visits his people, he sees 2 Israelites fighting against each other. And he tries to break them up. One man pushes him away, and who made you a judge and a ruler over us? Are you going to kill me just as you did the Egyptian? Now, there are several things there. Very good question. Who made Moses a judge and a ruler over them? Did he have the authority from Pharaoh? Absolutely not. Did he have the authority from God? Absolutely not. Did he have the authority from the people of Israel voting him and wanting him? Nope. So who gave him the authority? Only himself. And what you will find when it comes to the second 40 years of Moses' life and the third 40 years of Moses' life. The first one, he went into the wilderness and wandered in the wilderness alone for 40 years because he said, I can do it, without the thought of God involvement. The next 40 years he would wander in the wilderness was with the people of Israel. And do you know why that happened? Because they said, we can't do it. And they didn't consider God in the picture. They said, we can't go into the promised land because they're stronger than we are. So the first 40 years, from 40 to 80, Moses says, I can do it. And God says, nope, you're not ready. The last 40 years, the people says, we can't do it. And God says, yep, you're not ready. Until Moses learned that he had to be fully dependent on God, and until Israel learned they had to be fully dependent on God, neither one of them were ready. And you know, there's a statement, it's often referred to C.S. Lewis, but in looking it up, it wasn't actually a quote from C.S. Lewis. He has a paragraph in Mere Christianity that kind of has the idea, but the quote is, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. That quote is actually from Rick Warren in his Purpose-Driven Life book, but it's often attributed to C.S. Lewis. But it doesn't actually come directly, it's more of a paragraph. But what that is saying, it's not about thinking less of yourself. I'm so awful. I'm pathetic. I can't do it. I'm a failure. Because that is a form of pride, just in the same way as I can do it. I can do it on my own. And the reason why they're both forms of pride is because the focus is on I. And so that quote, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. It's meaning it's not even considering me in the picture, it's about considering God and others. When you fast forward to the scene, Exodus chapter 3, in verse 9 through 14, in fact, the 40 years in the wilderness, Stephen sums up, well, in verse 29 of chapter 7, it says, then at this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons, and when 40 years had passed. He had 2 sons. That is the only thing that is mentioned about his 40 years in Stephen's sermon. It was 40 years of the mundane. 40 years of nothing spectacular. 40 years of watching sheep. Yes, he got married. Yes, he had 2 sons. But God, what am I doing here? God, what's the purpose in all of this? And maybe it was, I have made a mess of things. I thought I was the one that God wanted to lead the children out of the land of Egypt. And look at what's happened now. I killed a man, and Pharaoh's out to kill me. And here I am in the wilderness. And my time and my life is wasting away. But as I mentioned earlier, when we often desire the circumstances around us to change, we have to consider maybe God desires the character within us to change. And at the end of that 40 years, in Exodus chapter 3, you find Moses encountering the burning bush that was not consumed. And God speaks to him through the burning bush. And in verse 9 it says, now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me. God speaking to Moses. And he says, I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And what is Moses' reply? But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Who am I? I'm the one that killed a man and had to run. Who am I? He didn't say, God, finally it's my time. I mean, I was trained. And you know, when you stop and think about the training of leaders, universities, platforms, programs, in the training of leaders, so often there is so much education and skills and abilities and all of that. But how many of those programs teach character? Think about that. And yet, how many leaders, great, abled, and skilled leaders, have failed because of character? And that first 40 years of Moses' life, he was shaped in the world's view as a great leader. But it had to be the next 40 years that all of that had to be chipped away and chiseled away to shape him into a great leader in God's view. And when God responded there in verse 12, Exodus chapter 3, after Moses asks, who am I that I should go? God did not respond and say, you're Moses, the one who has been trained in Egypt, the one who has been highly educated. No, God's response was, so he said, I will certainly be with you. And this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God did not say, hey, look at yourself. He said, I will be with you. Every step of the way, I will be with you. And that was what Moses needed. It was this spirit of humility and total dependence on God that made Moses ready for the task ahead of him. He would, when he returned to Egypt, Aaron and Moses report to the people. Aaron speaks about what God had relayed to Moses. Moses showed the signs that God had given to him, that he had been sent, and the people were all about it and excited until Pharaoh ups the tasks and the burdens and the afflictions and the persecution. And before they even leave, the people begin complaining to Moses. In Exodus 5:21, and they said to them, let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? Before they even left Egypt, the people are starting to blame Moses. You have caused all of these problems on us. And Moses says, God, why did you bring me to this? But constantly, all throughout Moses' life, for the next 40 years, he would hear complaints, he would hear criticism. You read Numbers chapter 12, Miriam questions Moses about God speaking through him. Numbers chapter 16 and 17, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, along with 250 leaders, question Moses, lifting himself, exalting himself above the people. In fact, in Numbers 16:3, it says, they gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, you take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them. And the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? Korah was of the family, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, which was the same family line that Moses and Aaron were a part of. They were of the son of Kohath, the son of Levi. And Korah says, Who made you any different than us? Why are you lifting yourselves up? But all throughout the complaints, Moses did not exalt himself. He fell on his face before God. But that was only learned in those 40 years in the wilderness. Now, if we were to look at the plagues, and we won't go through those. You could read through those. I believe it's chapter 6 through chapter 12 of Exodus. And God revealed his power. And I don't believe it was necessarily revealing his power to the Egyptians as much as it was revealing his power to the Israelites. Revealing his power to Moses, Aaron, and the people. And you know, as we consider the life of Moses, very few people throughout the scriptures you learn about their birth, their life, and their death. But Moses is one of those. Greatly used by God, leading the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt into the, well, not into the promised land, that was Joshua. Lord willing, we'll look at that next week. But it was the 40 years in the wilderness of wondering, why, God? I've messed up. But it was those 40 years that he had to take off the dependence of himself and recognize and depend on God's presence. And it was then and only then that God could use him for the great task ahead of him. And when we are looking and trying to make all the changes of the circumstances around us, we have to stop and ask God, what is the character within me that needs to be shaped and changed and become more like you? When we consider about, as believers, what is God's goal in our lives? Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 13, it mentions, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. God's desire for each one of us is that we would look more like Jesus Christ. In one sense, God is the great sculptor. And it's mentioned, here is a quote from 1858 and the Methodist Quarterly Review speaking about sculptor. It is the sculptor's power, so often alluded to, of finding the perfect form and feature in the shapeless block of marble, and his ability to chip off all extraneous matter, and let the divine excellence stand forth for itself. Thus, in every incident of business, in every accident of life, the poet sees something divine and carefully scales off all that encumbers that divinity and permits it to be revealed in all its transcendent loveliness. In one sense, a sculptor takes a block of marble, but he sees the end product and he chips away everything that does not belong in the great statue or whatever it might be. And in the same way, God sees, when he looks at us, his desire for the end product is us to become shaped more like Jesus Christ. And he will chip things away. And at times it may not be pleasant. At times it may be a long wait. But we have to remember God is at work in our lives. Let's pray.